Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Now, we often hear the word insecurity thrown around, right? Sometimes it's about a guy who's insecure about his height, or maybe a country that's insecure about its Wi-Fi speed. But today, we're going to talk about a different kind of insecurity, a much more serious kind. Today, we're counting down the 20 countries with the highest levels of insecurity in the world. And let me tell you, it's a list that's both heartbreaking and incredibly important to understand. It's a side of the world that doesn't always make the headlines, but affects millions and millions of people every single day. So, what do we actually mean by insecurity in this context? It's not about feeling awkward at a party. We're talking about a fundamental lack of safety and stability. Think of it as a perfect storm of bad things happening all at once. Widespread violence, political instability, where the government is either part of the problem or can't do anything to fix it, and active ongoing conflicts. It's about living in a place where the threat of harm is a constant daily reality, where you can't be sure if your kids will come home from school or if there will be food on the table tomorrow. It's the kind of environment where just surviving the day is a victory. This list is compiled from data from various international organizations, looking at everything from conflict-related deaths to political terror scales and the number of displaced people. It's a sobering look at the parts of our world that are in crisis. But it's not just about listing problems. It's about understanding the human stories behind the statistics. Because behind every number is a family, a community, a life turned upside down. So stick with me as we journey through these 20 countries, not to gawk at the chaos, but to gain a deeper appreciation for the fragility of peace and the resilience of the human spirit. Let's get into it. Kicking off our list at number 20 is Cameroon. Now, for many people, Cameroon might bring to mind amazing football players like Samuel Eto'o or lush rainforests. But beneath that surface, there's a serious and often overlooked conflict simmering. The main driver of insecurity here is the Anglophone crisis, a separatist conflict in the English-speaking regions of the country. It started with protests over language and marginalization, and has since escalated into a brutal armed conflict. It's one of those situations that barely makes the international news, but the impact on the ground is devastating. You have armed separatist groups clashing with government forces, and as is so often the case, it's the civilians who are caught in the middle. We're talking about villages being burned, kidnappings for ransom becoming commonplace, and hundreds of thousands of people forced to flee their homes. Imagine having to leave everything you've ever known behind, not because of a natural disaster, but because your own countrymen are fighting a war in your backyard. It creates an environment of constant fear and uncertainty, where trust in authority, and even in your neighbors, completely breaks down. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. The conflict has crippled the local economy, shut down schools, and overwhelmed the healthcare system. On top of the Anglophone crisis, Cameroon also has to deal with the spillover of violence from Boko Haram in its far north region, adding another layer of complexity and suffering. It's a stark reminder that a country's stability can be fractured along lines that many of us don't even think about, like language and colonial history, leading to a deep and lasting insecurity for its people. Coming in at number 19, we have Sudan. This is a country that has been a poster child for conflict for decades, from the long civil war that led to the creation of South Sudan to the crisis in Darfur. Just when it seemed like there was a glimmer of hope after the ousting of Omar al-Bashir in 2019, the country has once again plunged into chaos. The current crisis is a power struggle, a brutal fight between two generals who were once allies, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. This isn't a conventional war fought on some distant battlefield. The fighting is happening right in the streets of major cities like the capital, Khartoum. Imagine waking up to the sound of gunfire and airstrikes in a dense urban area. That's the reality for millions. The conflict has shattered the country's infrastructure, destroyed hospitals, and led to widespread shortages of food, water, and medicine. It's a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in real time, driven by the ambitions of a few powerful men. The situation has also reignited ethnic violence in regions like Darfur, bringing back horrifying memories of the genocide that occurred there in the early 2000s. The Rapid Support Forces, which grew out of the infamous Janjaweed militia, is accused of committing widespread atrocities. Millions have been displaced, either internally or fleeing to neighboring countries that are already struggling. Sudan's story is a tragic one of a nation with so much potential, repeatedly torn apart by internal power struggles, leaving its people to pay the ultimate price. At number 18, we land in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar. For a brief period, Myanmar was seen as a success story, a nation moving from decades of military dictatorship towards democracy, with Aung San Suu Kyi as its civilian leader. But that hope came to a screeching halt in February 2021 when the military, known as the Tatmadaw, staged a coup, arrested the elected leaders, and seized power once again. What followed was not a quiet transition, but a nationwide uprising met with brutal force. The military has responded to peaceful protests with live ammunition, mass arrests, and torture. This has pushed many people to take up arms, leading to the formation of People's Defense Forces and a full-blown civil conflict across the country. It's a multi-front war. The military is not only fighting these new pro-democracy militias, but it's also engaged in long-running conflicts with various ethnic armed organizations that have been fighting for autonomy for decades. It's a complex web of alliances and enmities, with the civilian population bearing the brunt of the violence. The military has been accused of committing war crimes, including airstrikes on villages, schools, and even camps for displaced people. The economy is in freefall, the healthcare system has collapsed, and millions have been forced from their homes. The situation is particularly dire for ethnic minorities like the Rohingya, who faced a genocidal campaign of violence even before the coup and now find themselves in an even more precarious position. Myanmar is a tragic example of how quickly the promise of democracy can be extinguished, leaving a legacy of violence and instability in its wake. Now for a country that has been at the forefront of global headlines, at number 17, Ukraine. The full-scale invasion by Russia in February 2022 transformed a simmering conflict in the East into the largest conventional war in Europe since World War II. This isn't just about two armies fighting. It's an existential struggle for Ukraine's survival as a sovereign nation. The level of destruction is staggering, with entire cities like Mariupol and Bakhmut being reduced to rubble. It's a war that has brought 20th-century trench warfare and 21st-century drone technology together in a horrifying spectacle. The primary source of insecurity, obviously, is the ongoing war. Daily life for millions of Ukrainians is punctuated by air raid sirens, missile strikes, and the constant threat of violence. The war has targeted not just military positions, but civilian infrastructure, power plants, hospitals, schools, and apartment buildings. This is a deliberate strategy to break the will of the Ukrainian people, to make life unlivable. The human cost is immense, with tens of thousands of civilians killed and millions more forced to flee their homes, creating the largest refugee crisis in Europe in decades. Beyond the immediate physical danger, the war has created layers of insecurity. There's the psychological trauma that will affect generations. There's the economic devastation, with the country's GDP plummeting. And there's the global insecurity it has caused, disrupting food and energy supplies and raising the terrifying specter of nuclear conflict. Ukraine's fight is a stark reminder that in our interconnected world, a war in one country can send shockwaves across the entire globe, and that the peace many of us take for granted is incredibly fragile. Our countdown continues at number 16 with Chad. If you look at a map of this region, Chad is right in the middle of a very tough neighborhood. It's bordered by Libya, Sudan, the Central African Republic, all countries facing their own major crises. For a long time, Chad was seen as a relative bastion of stability, an important Western ally in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel. But that stability has always been precarious, and now it's starting to crumble from both external pressures and internal rot. The country is dealing with multiple security threats at once. In the Lake Chad Basin, it's fighting remnants of Boko Haram and its offshoot, ISWAP. In the north, it faces threats from Chadian rebel groups based in neighboring Libya. And now, with the conflict in Sudan, it's dealing with a massive influx of refugees pouring across its eastern border, putting an immense strain on already limited resources. It's like trying to patch leaks on a boat while being hit by a hurricane from 3 different directions. The political situation is also incredibly fragile. After the longtime president, Idris Deby, was killed on the battlefield in 2021, his son took over in what many called a dynastic coup. This has created deep political divisions and resentment. The military government has cracked down on dissent, and there's a constant threat of rebel groups trying to march on the capital. For ordinary Chadians, this means living in a state of high alert, where political instability at the top could trigger widespread violence at any moment, on top of the existing threats from extremist groups and regional conflicts. At number 15, we travel to the Caribbean, to Haiti. This is a country that has endured a history of political instability, poverty, and devastating natural disasters. But the current situation is arguably the worst it has been in decades. Haiti today is facing a near-total collapse of the state. The assassination of President Jovenel Moise in 2021 created a massive power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped powerful and ruthless criminal gangs. These gangs now control large parts of the capital, Port-au-Prince, and other areas. They control key infrastructure like the main fuel terminal and major roads, effectively holding the country's economy hostage. But this isn't just about turf wars. The gangs are engaged in systematic violence against the population. Kidnappings for ransom are rampant, as are extortion, sexual violence, and massacres. For many residents of Port-au-Prince, leaving their homes means risking their lives. The police are outgunned and overwhelmed, and there is no functioning democratic government to speak of. This security crisis is happening on top of a dire humanitarian situation. Gang blockades have led to critical shortages of food, clean water, and medical supplies. A cholera outbreak has spread rapidly, a direct consequence of the breakdown in sanitation and healthcare. It's a vicious cycle. Political instability fuels gang power, gang violence deepens the humanitarian crisis, and the crisis makes any political solution seem impossible. Haiti is a heartbreaking example of how quickly a nation can descend into anarchy when its institutions fail. Moving back to West Africa, at number 14 is Burkina Faso. Just a few years ago, this country was known for its vibrant culture and art scene. But today, it's sadly known as the epicenter of the violent extremist crisis sweeping the Sahel region. The country has seen a catastrophic rise in attacks by groups affiliated with both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. What started as a spillover from neighboring Mali has now engulfed vast swaths of Burkina Faso's territory. The violence is indiscriminate and brutal. Militants attack army bases, but they also systematically target civilians, raiding villages, executing local leaders, and forcing people to adhere to their extremist ideology. They blow up bridges, blockade towns, and attack convoys, creating a siege-like mentality in many parts of the country. More than a third of Burkina Faso's territory is now outside of state control. It's a staggering loss of sovereignty in a very short amount of time. This insecurity has triggered one of the fastest-growing displacement crises in the world, with over 2 million people forced from their homes. It has also led to political chaos. The government's inability to stem the violence has resulted in 2 military coups in 2022 alone. The current military junta has promised to reclaim the country, but the situation remains dire. Burkina Faso's struggle really highlights the terrifying speed at which extremist violence can destabilize a nation, unraveling its social fabric and leaving a trail of human suffering. At number 13, we have Pakistan. This is a country that juggles a complex array of security challenges, both internal and external. For decades, Pakistan has been on the front line of the war on terror, and it has paid a heavy price. One of the biggest threats comes from the Pakistani Taliban, or TTP, a group that is distinct from but ideologically aligned with the Afghan Taliban. After a period of relative calm, the TTP has resurged, launching attacks against security forces, particularly in the regions bordering Afghanistan. But it's not just the TTP. Pakistan also contends with other militant groups, including Baloch nationalist insurgents in its largest province, Balochistan, who are fighting for a greater share of the region's natural resource wealth and autonomy. This creates a multi-front internal conflict for the country's security forces. On top of this, there's the ever-present tension with its neighbor India over the disputed territory of Kashmir, a nuclear flashpoint that keeps both nations on high alert. Adding another layer of instability is Pakistan's volatile political climate and severe economic crisis. High inflation, political infighting, and frequent changes in leadership create an environment of uncertainty that can be exploited by militant groups. The devastating floods in 2022 also exacerbated the country's problems, displacing millions and destroying infrastructure, further straining the state's resources. For Pakistan, insecurity is a constant balancing act, managing militant threats, political turmoil, economic woes, and a tense relationship with its neighbors. Coming in at number 12, we go to South America, to Venezuela. The insecurity here is not driven by a traditional civil war or a foreign invasion, but by a catastrophic political and economic collapse. It's a man-made disaster. Years of mismanagement, corruption, and authoritarian rule under first Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro have completely hollowed out what was once one of the wealthiest countries in the region. The result is a multifaceted crisis that touches every aspect of life. First, there's the rampant crime. With the state institutions and the economy in ruins, violent crime has skyrocketed. Homicide rates are among the highest in the world. Kidnappings and armed robberies are common. In many areas, particularly in informal settlements and border regions, the state has lost control to a variety of armed groups, including criminal gangs known as colectivos, Colombian guerrilla groups like the ELN, and syndicates involved in illegal mining. There's a pervasive sense of lawlessness where no one feels safe. Then there is the profound economic insecurity. Hyperinflation has made the currency virtually worthless. There are chronic shortages of food, medicine, electricity, and running water. This has led to a humanitarian crisis and one of the largest migration outflows in recent history, with over 7 million Venezuelans fleeing the country. This isn't just about poverty, it's about the complete breakdown of the social contract, where the state can no longer provide the most basic services or security for its citizens, leaving them in a desperate struggle for survival. At number 11, we find ourselves back in the Sahel in Mali. This country can be seen as ground zero for the crisis that has now spread to its neighbors like Burkina Faso and Niger. The current cycle of instability began in 2012 when separatist rebels and then Islamist militants captured the northern two-thirds of the country. A French-led military intervention pushed them back, but they were never truly defeated. Instead, they regrouped and adapted, spreading their influence into the central regions of Mali. The security situation here is honestly defined by a complex mix of actors. You have groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, you have ethnic self-defense militias, and you have criminal networks involved in trafficking. These groups, well, they exploit intercommunal tensions, particularly between farming and herding communities, turning local disputes into brutal conflicts. They attack military outposts, but they also terrorize civilians, imposing their will, extorting so-called taxes, and carrying out massacres. For many Malians, especially in rural areas, the state is completely absent, and these armed groups are the de facto authority. Like its neighbors, Mali has also experienced significant political turmoil, with 2 military coups since 2020. The ruling junta has fallen out with its traditional international partners, most notably France, and has kicked out the UN peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA. Instead, they've turned to Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group for security assistance. This pivot has, honestly, just further complicated the situation, with Wagner itself being accused of widespread human rights abuses. Mali is trapped in a cycle of violence and political instability, with no clear path to peace. Breaking into our top 10 is Libya at number 10. More than a decade after the 2011 NATO-backed uprising that overthrew Muammar Gaddafi, the promise of a democratic and stable Libya has failed to materialize. Instead, the country fractured, descending into a prolonged and complex civil war. The nation has been split between rival governments and a dizzying array of militias, all vying for control of territory and the country's vast oil wealth. The main source of insecurity is really this political and military division. For years, the country was essentially divided between an administration in the east,